the Arizona Corporate Commission.
Like this.
So thank you.
There we go.
Carol.
That's good. Keep your fingers away.
Yeah, see that.
Thank you to Judy.
Okay.
I've got to take a swig of water here.
Right. Is this your water?
Yeah, we got a good sign.
Well, I want to welcome you to the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson's education program on the Arizona Corporation Commission. And from now on, I will refer to it as the ACC. This forum will be live streamed for those who cannot attend, and it will be available on our Facebook page. And as Judy said, I hope that all of you have taken a moment to turn off your cell phones. Well, what is the ACC? It's the Public Utilities Commission charged with regulating Arizona utilities and setting rates that are fair and reasonable for both providers and consumers. The ACC also has broad jurisdiction over pipelines, railroads, securities, and corporations. As a matter of fact, the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson Treasurer files paperwork every year with the Corporation Commission at a cost of $10. The ACC is often referred to as the fourth branch of Arizona government. The 5 elected commissioners function in an executive capacity, but when they adopt rules and regulations, they function in a legislative capacity. They act as a judicial body when they make decisions on contested matters like rate setting. These powers were placed in the Arizona Constitution when we became a state in 1912. For more information, see Janetta Truitt's paper on the topic. We have some of those in the back. There was also a link in the voter for you to refer to this paper. Now it is time to begin our program. Unfortunately, Dr. Sharon Megdal is unable to be here today because of a family matter. We will hear from 2 speakers on how utilities interface with the ACC, who advocates for consumers on rate settings, and whether the commission, as it currently exists, will be effective in leading the state towards its proposed energy goals. I will introduce each of our speakers just before they begin their presentations. After both have spoken for 20 minutes each, you will be able to ask questions. Please write your questions on the cards provided, and a monitor will bring them to me for the panel's responses. This will save time so that we can focus on as many of your questions as possible because we're all in a learning mode this morning. Our first speaker, Chris Norman, earned a master's degree in business administration from the University of Arizona. He joined Tucson Electric Power in 2001 and is currently the Director of Regulatory Policy and Chief of Staff to the CEO. Much of his time is spent in oversight of the company's proceedings and applications before the ACC. Chris will address what the ACC does and the rate-making process. He may also touch on ways the process could be improved. So Chris, welcome.
Thanks, Carol. Well, good morning, and thank you to the League for having Chris and I today on a Saturday morning. There's certainly probably more interesting things you could be doing, so we're glad you're here with us today. So again, my name is Chris Norman. I work for Tucson Electric Power. So at TEP, at every meeting we have, before we start, we have a safety minute. And so real quickly, it looks like our nearest exits are right behind us. In case of emergency, we'll orderly exit that way and either up the stairs. So check the box. So I'll make everybody happy back at the office. So really quickly before we start, I think most of you are familiar with TEP. We are your electric service provider here in Tucson. We also serve Fort Huachuca just down the road near Sierra Vista. So we serve in 2 counties here in Arizona. We have about 425,000 customers, spanning all different types from residential, commercial, large commercial. You're all very familiar with the community here. So Carol did an excellent introduction of the Arizona Corporation Commission. I'll do just a little bit deeper dive and then also get into the rate making process and how we go about setting the rates that appear on all of your bills on a monthly basis. Not as easy as you might think, so let's get going here real quick. So real quickly, as Carol mentioned, Arizona Corporation Commission has constitutionally created authority in Article 15 of our state constitution. We're a little bit unique, as you see on the map on the right. We're one of 7 states that has a constitutionally created commission, which makes us a little bit unique. And as Carol mentioned, they're often referred to as the 4th branch of government, as Chris can attest to, has legislative, executive, judicial types of authority as a member of the commission. We're one of 13 states with an elected commission, which makes us even a little bit more unique than the rest of the country. Each commissioner can serve 2 4-year consecutive terms, or in some cases, as with our current Commissioner Kennedy, they can serve 1 term and then come back later and serve another term. And in the year 2000, interestingly, the commission expanded from 3 members to the current 5 members that we have today. And that segues into our current 5 commissioners. That I'll give real brief bios on here. So starting from the left, and these were our 2 newest elected commissioners in the 2018 election cycle. Sandra Kennedy, who I mentioned a minute ago, served on the commission in 2008 for a 4-year term. Long career in public service, was in the state legislature for many years, and served with Chris on the Arizona Corporation Commission, like I said, in 2008 from 2012. Commissioner Justin Olson also served in the House of Representatives for about 6 years. He has an extensive background in tax, which will become very useful in some aspects of his role on the commission. He was appointed to the commission in 2017 when there was a vacant seat left by Doug Little, who joined the Department of Energy. So Commissioner Olson served a very short 1-year term and then was reelected this past election cycle in 2018. And then we have 3 commissioners, current commissioners, who are in the middle of their 4-year terms. We have the chairman, Bob Burns, who has an extensive, very long career in public service dating back to the late 80s when he served in both the House and Senate. He did serve as president of the Senate, and then, like I mentioned, he's in the 2nd of his two terms on the commission. Commissioner Boyd Dunn is a former mayor of Chandler, retired Superior Court judge, and also has a long career of public service in his community and has a private law firm that he left but had 24 years of practice there. And then finally, Commissioner Andy Tobin, again, comes from the legislature, was Speaker of the House, and has served in various roles in state government for Governor Ducey. So those are our current 5 commissioners today. So the rate making process at TEP. And so I always joke, I've given this presentation several times, even to lots of folks at TEP, because this is a very opaque, confusing process that, as Chris can attest to, there's a very steep learning curve. So there are courses, week-long courses that you can go to learn this stuff. I'm going to teach you all in 5 minutes. So, buckle up. And so real quick, just by show of hands, and I already kind of tipped it off, and so did Carol, but hopefully you all understand that we just don't arbitrarily set the rates that appear in your bills. So there's a very detailed process that we go through with the commission. And so very simply, I'm going to break it down as simply as I can, and again, we'll save questions for the end, but if there are questions, I'm happy to answer those. And so I threw some kind of terms up here, some utility rate making nerd terms that we can talk about a little bit. But in a nutshell, the rate making process, it's 3 fairly simple steps. So what we do when we get ready to file an application with the commission is we close the books for a particular period of time. So we call that our test year. So for example, we provided notice a couple weeks ago that TEP plans to file another rate application here this spring. So our test year will be 2018. So we close the books, we do a bunch of analysis, we look at what our operating expenses are, we look at what we've invested for safe, reliable service for our customers, and then there's a rate of return attached to that. And why do we have a rate of return on our investments? We've got to continue to spend money to upgrade the system, and so that money that we make on there, we reinvest in capital to keep the lights on for our customers. And so we come up with what's called a revenue requirement. What do we need to collect from customers to cover those operating expenses like salaries, wages, investments in poles and wires and generating facilities. And because we're nearing lunchtime, think of that as a piece of pizza. And so that's our revenue requirement, the whole pizza. So the next step then is to figure out, okay, so we've got lots of different types of customers. They use the system differently, but how do we divide that piece of pizza between that whole pizza, between our residential customers, our small commercial customers, our large commercial customers, and our mining customers, which are our large, we call large power customers. And so this isn't totally representative of how those revenues are divided up, but this gives you an idea. And I put some logos up there to give you an idea of what kind of customers are in those classes. So, obviously you all drive around town and see customers, but we try to divide them in similarly situated categories. So we have your Kroger's and Walmart's and Fry's in one particular category, the U of A, Raytheon in a different category, and our mining customers we treat totally different because their power needs are much more unique and greater than other customers. And then our largest segment, not surprisingly, is our residential customers. I think Chris is going to get into this a little bit, but part of the rate making process is there's a lot of folks that participate. It's not just the utility and the commission. Customer groups are often represented in this process as well. And so we have the Residential Utility Consumer Office, which is a state agency that's funded on your customer bills that advocate on behalf of residential customers. And I know Chris is going to cover this, so I won't go into too much detail. But we often have our larger customers participate, not surprisingly. So Walmart will hire folks to participate in our cases. Freeport, the big mining company, will often participate, as well as several others. So once we determine we've got the whole pizza, we slice it up among our customer classes. Then the last step then is to design specific rates for our customers. And so we come up with different rate options. I've shown you here the rate options for our residential customers. I won't go into a whole lot of detail, but happy to answer questions at the end on those. But we have our standard rates, which are your monthly customer charge, and then you just build on the usage that you use every month. And then some optional rates, depending on how closely you want to manage your usage based on the time of use and other factors. We have those options for our customers too that want a little more hands-on management over their bill. And so as I mentioned, this isn't just a 2 or 3 week process that we do and then rates automatically appear on your bill. There's quite a process that goes into it. So I'll step you through that real quickly. And again, this is very high level. But so what happens? I mentioned earlier we establish what's called a test year for our rates, and then we file an application with the commission. And so that application includes lots of different information, from accounting type information, engineering information, justification for why we built a substation in a certain part of town, why perhaps we had to upgrade facilities for a large customer, why we invested in certain generating facilities, and there's supporting testimony. So think of this more like it's almost a court proceeding where we have the burden of proof to explain to the commission and our customers why the rates we're proposing are just, reasonable, and in the public interest. And we have 10 or 12 witnesses that will support all the numbers, all the policies, all the different rates that we're proposing. And there's experts in all those fields that file hundreds of pages of testimony into the docket. And then what then happens is we make that filing, and then we go before an administrative law judge, and they'll set up a schedule of how this process is going to play out. This tends to be a 12 to 15 to sometimes 18-month process, depending on the complexity of the case, as well as the other workloads that the commission staff has at that particular time. So after we file, there's a long period of discovery. Well, what does that mean? That means that all those interested parties in the case, like I mentioned earlier, the Residential Utility Consumer Office, often low-income advocacy groups will participate, our larger customers will participate. They have a chance to answer questions about all the information we filed, and we provide that data back to those customers so they can formulate their own opinions. And then what happens is that those that choose to formally participate in the case, that tends to be commission staff, RUCO, as I mentioned before, our large customers, they will file their testimony, either in support of some of the things that we filed or in opposition. And so they file their testimony in supporting information. So there's a few rounds of back and forth between the company and the interveners. And then what often happens is the commission, before we go to a hearing before the judge, will have public comment sessions where the public, and all through the process, the public can participate as well. But this is a formal process where the public can come and provide public comment in front of the commissioners. And then we get to the step when we go before an administrative law judge. And again, I mentioned this is similar to a court proceeding. It really is. So we have a judge that presides. All of those witnesses that filed testimony on our behalf are available for cross-examination by other parties. Similarly, those parties that filed testimony and offered witnesses are available for cross-examination as well. So it's a very detailed process. This hearing can last up to a couple of weeks, again, depending on the complexity of the issues. After the hearing, the parties then file their briefs, again, supporting the positions that they supported in testimony and at the hearing. And then the judge will come out with a recommendation. We call it a recommended opinion in order. That document then would be subject to final approval by the 5 commissioners. And they have the ability to accept that order as written by the judge. They can modify it however they see fit, or they can reject it outright. And so that's usually, that gets us to the end of the 15-month process. And so what does one of these things look like? Just to show you that that's what 13 copies of a rate filing look like. And that's what commissioners, advisors, and staff have the pleasure of reading. What we try to do, though, as you see, there's hundreds of pages in there. We try to, first couple pages is an executive summary, because we certainly don't expect everybody to read every page, but again.
Some of us did.
And that's a good segue. One of the questions that was posed at the beginning are what are the ideal qualifications for a commissioner? And I thought about this last night. We were chatting over here, and Chris stole some of my talking points, but really it's someone who works collaboratively, is willing to dive into this stuff and understand it as best they can, and ask the tough questions. What we don't like are those that don't read, that don't understand the issues, and don't ask the tough questions. And so that's as simply as I can answer that question. And I think that's a great transition now to former Commissioner Chris Mays.
Thank you, Chris. Our next speaker, Kristin Mays, is a former ACC commissioner, as you heard, who served from 2003 to 2010. She holds a Juris Doctor of Law from ASU and is currently a professor of practice in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at ASU. Chris will address the ACC's current scope of authority and highlight some of the predominant issues the ACC will perhaps be working on in this next 4-year term. She will also give us some background on the Residential Utility Consumer Office, or RUCO. As a former commissioner, she will be able to touch on whether the ACC's current scope of authority is appropriate, and if the ACC has set realistic goals for renewable energy sources. Chris?
Thank you, Carol. It's terrific to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Having some nervousness and flashbacks looking at those papers behind me. But it really is a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the League for hosting this session, for having Chris and I here to talk about this really important topic. As Carol mentioned, I've had the pleasure of serving you as one of your corporation commissioners from 2003 to 2010. I served as the chairman from 2008 to 2009, 2010. And so I've had a 20-year love affair with the Corporation Commission. That's sort of the way I like to put it. I fell in love with the commission the day I set foot there, and I continue to be in love with it, and believe that it is something that more voters should be introduced to, and that we really need to do a better job of educating folks about the importance of it in their everyday lives. And in fact, I often refer to the Corporation Commission as the most powerful branch of government that nobody knows about in Arizona. And so this is a great session for that. And I was just reflecting that it was 107 years ago this week that our founding fathers were sitting in Phoenix deliberating what would be the state capitol about what our Constitution should look like in Arizona. And they were, in fact, deliberating what the branches of government would look like, the 4 branches of government. And I've had the chance to study the constitutional minutes of the Constitutional Convention, and a fascinating thing comes clear in those discussions that our founding fathers had on that really sweltering summer that they spent on this, which is that they spent more time talking about the Corporation Commission than any other branch of government. Just let that sink in. They spent more pages of the minutes are devoted to this than the legislature, the governorship, the judiciary. So they're more passionate about this than anything else, and I think a lot of that had to do with the times. So when you think about it, the commission was created basically at the turn of the century. At the same time, a lot of other states were starting to create their public utility commissions, and this was at a time when New York, Governor Hughes in New York, Governor of Illinois, the President, Teddy Roosevelt, were railing against monopolies, trust busting, and there was a deep suspicion of monopolies in this country and the power of large corporations over the average person. And that deep suspicion existed here in Arizona too, interestingly enough. So at the state constitutional convention 107 years ago this week, it was progressive Republicans who joined with conservative Democrats to create this bulwark of power against the power of big monopolies. And I think that's what's so important to me personally about the commission, is that this is supposed to be the representative. It is truly the most populist branch of government when you think about it, because it exists to protect people against the power of big monopolies, which still exist in this country, and Chris, is here representing one of them. They have to do a really good job most of the time, and every once in a while they didn't, and I made it clear to them they weren't doing a good job, but that's the job of commissioners. So I think it's important to remember that, and that was how the commission was formed here in Arizona as well. Today, indeed, all 50 states have a public utility commission. Usually it's called a PUC, sometimes Public Service Commission. If you're from another state, you probably heard another term. And most commissions have 5, some have 3 members. Oftentimes they are, as Chris mentioned, appointed by the governor. Arizona is one of the only states that has both an elected commission and is lodged in the Constitution, and it's a statewide elected office. So think about this. 5 of the 11 statewide offices in Arizona are the Corporation Commission. So when you step into that voting booth in 2020 to elect 3 of the 5 commissioners, the 5 commissioners represent a huge chunk of the statewide offices in the state. So it's a really, really important vote for that reason alone, and for a lot of other reasons. So in Arizona, 5-member commission, and it's that confluence of factors, elected statewide, lodged in the Constitution, and also so elected statewide, lodged in the Constitution, that and it being statewide, that makes many people believe that it's the most powerful public utility commission in America, actually. So that's our Corporation Commission. The governor cannot tell the commissioners what to do. The legislature cannot tell the commissioners what to do. And only the judiciary has some review over the commission decisions. And often the state judiciary is quite deferential to the commission and to its decisions. As was already mentioned, the commission basically decides whether utilities exist. So they issue licenses to do business. TEP has one. It's called the CCNN. I'm going to show those in a second. They determine just and reasonable rates. What do you pay in your bills? What, you know, so this body influences and affects every aspect of our life and our economy, and in many ways, the futures of our children and our children's children in setting energy policy. I'm going to talk a lot about that today. These are the service territories of the electric utilities in Arizona. The area in green is APS, so you can see that APS is the most sprawling and the largest utility. Chris, if I'm not mistaken, you guys are purple up there, is that right?
We're the
Red?
brownish orange there in Tucson.
Brownish orange, and then your purple.
Purple as well, and blue.
Yeah. And then Unisource Electric is up in Mojave County. So, so those are all the electric utilities, which includes electric co-ops, which serve in largely rural parts of the state. These are the almost 300 private water companies that the commission regulates. So Arizona has more regulated water utilities than any other state in the country. Many of them are poorly run, frankly, poorly undercapitalized companies, and unfortunately in very fast-growing parts of the state. So one of the biggest issues, I spent 80% of my time actually working on problematic private water utilities that were basically falling apart after years of neglect. And I think it's one of the biggest issues that the commission will have to deal with going forward. My note to you, if you're thinking of moving, check to see whether what kind of a water company is serving that area, okay? Be very, very careful about where you buy your next house and look at the water company and how well it's being run. And the utility, the electric utility as well. So I'll skip over that. Just a brief note about RUCO, and we can talk about this in the Q&A section of our discussion. RUCO is a very important state agency, so it's not a part of the Corporation Commission, but it is an agency whose director is appointed by the governor, and whoever that governor is. And the agency is tasked with protecting the interests of residential consumers before the Corporation Commission. So let's say TEP files that rate case that Chris mentioned. RUCO will intervene in the rate case as a party on your behalf, and they will make the arguments for you. Now, if you want to intervene on your own behalf, you can actually do that as well. The commission has very liberal intervention policies, such that generally speaking, the commission will allow pretty much anybody to participate in the case. But RUCO is supposed to represent your interests. And the next time you're voting for governor, I would ask you, do think about this too. What kind of a RUCO director is the next governor going to appoint? And if you want to trip off gubernatorial candidates, ask them that question at a forum, because they probably haven't thought about it, but this is actually really important to the economy of the state and to what kind of utility bills you pay, and by the way, to what kind of energy resources, I'm going to get into this, these utilities are utilizing. Are they utilizing the least cost resource today, which by the way is renewable energy, or are they trying to utilize resources that are more expensive for consumers, which today is coal and natural gas? So think about that going forward. So if you'll indulge me, I want to speak to what I think is really the pivotal central issue for future commissions, which is energy policy. And Chris touched on the sort of clear mandate of the commission, which is to set rates. The other clear mandate of the commission is to determine what kind of resources our utilities produce. And I had the great joy and fortune, frankly, of being your elected representative on the commission at a time when we were first setting the first real set of energy policies in this state. And I was the co-architect, along with a couple of other commissioners, of our current renewable energy standard, which is 15% by 2025. In other words, TEP has to produce 15% of its overall retail sales from solar, wind, biomass, biogas, geothermal, those types of resources, clean resources. We also set what is one of the country's most ambitious energy efficiency resource standards. And that said to these utilities, TEP, you must go out and reduce your overall electricity sales by 22% by 2020, because the most inexpensive resource is the negawatt, the watt we don't use. So if we install energy efficient lighting, I'm not sure these lights are energy efficient, but if we did install energy efficient LED lighting, that reduces the energy bill of this library. And that's the energy he doesn't have to produce with his power plants is way, way less expensive than the energy he does have to produce with his power plants. So we said to the utilities, you've got to do more than these energy efficiency measures. In these buildings, in our homes, helping consumers to install these measures. And in fact, Arizona is now the top state for energy efficiency west of the Mississippi. So imagine that, we're actually first in something. I mean, you know, right? Not stolen cars. That's right. So we also have one of the best net metering policies, which basically says to the utilities, you must purchase the excess energy that we produce from solar panels on our rooftops, right? So we set a very aggressive policy that got a little bit changed. I wasn't a big fan of the changes that the utilities advocated to it, but they still have to procure electricity from you at an appropriate rate, and that has spurred rooftop solar in Arizona to the point where Arizona is now the third best market in the country for rooftop solar. So we're third best in the country for rooftop solar, which is great. So these are just all the states that have renewable energy standards. This is actually a little bit outdated. California just announced they're going to go to 100% clean energy, renewable energy. Nevada just passed a ballot initiative to go to 50% renewable energy. New Mexico just governor just announced that they will go to at least 50, probably 80% renewable energy. Colorado, led by their utility, is going to 57% renewable energy. Unfortunately, here in Arizona, Prop 127 did not pass. I was an advocate of it. The utilities fought it. It would have took Arizona to 50% as well and kept us competitive. We do need to stay competitive in renewable energy in our state because, trust me, our surrounding states are moving forward with this. This again is your renewable energy standard, 15% by 2025. TEP and APS, I think, have already almost met it, right, Chris?
We're really close.
They're really close to already meeting this. So my view is you need to go further, guys.
Yeah.
Just saying. So this is the net metering policies in various states. These are the energy efficiency policies. Arizona, again, as I mentioned, has a great energy efficiency policy that we passed. And here's this is a graph that kind of shows why this is important. By telling the utilities they have to do all this energy efficiency, basically it means that they have to build 18 fewer power plants. Now, let's just think about all the different ways that matters to our state. Number one, power plants are really expensive to build. We're talking, in many cases, hundreds of millions of dollars. And as Chris pointed out, basically you are the ones who pay for those costs. Those get flowed through rates, right? Secondarily, of course, there are the environmental benefits. And while these statistics I'm going to read to you are associated with the renewable energy standard, they're very applicable to energy efficiency. By 2020, the renewable energy standard that we pass will result in 23 billion gallons of water saved for Arizona. That's kind of important these days. It will prevent more than 11,000 tons of nitrogen oxide from being emitted into the air. It prevents 9,000 tons of sulfur dioxide. It prevents 8 million tons of CO2 from being emitted. And it has created 10,000 jobs and 450 companies in the state of Arizona. So Lots and lots of benefits, and because these resources are now the lowest cost resource, no drawbacks as far as I can tell. So they have these policies that have been passed by your corporation commission and that could be amplified on by the next corporation commission and future commissions have resulted in projects. So this is Solana outside of Gila Bend. There are a number of other solar projects outside of Casa Grande and Gila Bend, and several here around Tucson. This is the ASU campus. I apologize, I don't have pictures of the U of A, but I'll try to get some. Both universities have done a lot of solar. ASU has now more solar on our campus than any other university on the planet.
Wow.
At, I think, more than 35 megawatts. The other thing is Arizonans want this. So every poll taken since I was a corporation commissioner has shown overwhelming bipartisan support for renewable energy. And almost always just as many Republicans as Democrats support renewables for different reasons, and I don't really care what those different reasons are, right? A lot of Republicans believe in the independence that it gives us, the right to produce your own power. Democrats tend to believe in the environmental benefits or focus on that. I think both are great. But every poll has shown this, including one that was released just this week. The other thing that's interesting is that it's happening everywhere. So can you guess what the fastest growing area for rooftop solar is in the state of Arizona?
Phoenix.
A part of Phoenix. Sun City. Sun City! The demographically oldest, the most conservative, is the most attracted to rooftop solar. And I'm not sure why, but a lot of people like the fact that it saves them money. And a lot of retirees, I am told, are talking to each other about it, you know, how their meters are running backwards over their fence posts. They're talking to each other about it, and they're, you know, anyway, it's a thing in Sun City. So I want to end with this. The other thing is, this is an inevitable thing. Renewable energy costs are declining dramatically. And so there's really no longer any reason. These are some of the headlines, including down here in Tucson, that we've seen. TEP has seen bids come in from renewable energy projects, especially solar, and especially even solar plus storage, in the, I think, Chris, like 2 cents a kilowatt?
Solar plus storage, 2 to 4 cents.
2 to 4 cents. Record low prices, which are undercutting the prices again of coal, natural gas, and in some cases almost even nuclear. So it's remarkable what's happened in the marketplace. Corporations are now increasingly attracted to and committing to renewable energy. These are all the corporate, not all, but some of the corporations that have said, we're going to power our operations with 100% clean energy. 100% clean energy. And so they're increasingly going to companies like TEP and saying, hey, TEP, we will not, or APS, we will not relocate our headquarters to Arizona unless you, TEP, will provide me with 100% clean energy. So from the standpoint of Arizona being and maintaining our competitiveness as a state, we have to have these utilities doing the right thing, or we cannot compete with California. We cannot compete with Nevada. We cannot compete with New Mexico. Not possibly for these corporate headquarters. And then cities, of course, are also committing to 100% clean energy. So a number of cities are increasingly saying we want our city operations, including libraries like this one, to be powered by renewable energy. Finally, we've seen a lot of fights over renewable energy, and this gets back to Chris's rate making. The problem is this. So why do utilities fight rooftop solar? Here's the reason. If I could just get up real quickly. So the reason is in this formula. And the reason is that TEP's revenues, the utilities' revenues, are set based on how much stuff they can put into this part of the formula. V minus D, that's their rate base. And the rate base of the utilities are basically all the big power plants and power lines that they can build. But when we put rooftop solar systems on our houses and do energy efficiency, that's fewer power plants that they can build, and that's less money that they can make. So ultimately, we are going to have to solve this problem of how do we maintain healthy utilities that can serve all customers, but also maintain a system in which people still have the right to go solar, and we can still do energy efficiency, and we can still protect our environment. That's a big problem. Part of the problem is that our regulatory system has not kept up with the advances of technology. I want to end with this picture. This is a picture of Deer Valley High School, and it's one of my favorite stories, and I always tell it, especially when I'm in the presence of a utility executive. So, this is Deer Valley High School. They put a megawatt of solar on their rooftops. That's a lot of solar. And this was back probably 10 years ago. And the principal of Deer Valley High School came before the Corporation Commission to tell us about this and to advocate for us to put more money towards schools being able to solarize their building. And so the commissioners started asking questions. We said, well, why did you do this? That's a lot. And he said, well, commissioners, he said, you know, the PTA kind of dug it, and the teachers really liked it, the administration thought it was a good idea, it would save us money. But he said it was the students who demanded it. And the students came to us and demanded that we solarize this building. And you know, you could have heard a pin drop in the hearing room at the Corporation Commission. Because all of a sudden it dawned on all of us, and I think everybody is sitting in the room, that is the future. That those students are going to go to college, and then they're going to graduate, and they're going to eventually worship, and they're not going to want to worship in a synagogue or a church that's not solarized. They're not going to work in a building that's not solarized. They're not going to want to live in a house that's not solarized or energy efficient. That's the future. And that is, thank God, that's the future, but it's also the future that these utilities are going to have to meet. So I'll end with that. Thank you so much for having me.
Those were wonderful presentations, and I personally feel I know a lot more about the commission now, so I thank you. I am amazed at these sophisticated questions we've got up here, so I may intersperse different topics because you've got so many good questions, and I want to remind you all questions must be in writing, and please give them to the monitor, and then we'll address them as best we can. There's one question, there were two questions on one card, but one of the questions that this probably is best for Kristin, is, are the commissioners paid?
Yes.
What is their salary?
So, in Arizona, good question. Yeah, that average that I gave up there was a little bit old, and it's nationwide. In Arizona, the commissioner, I should know this because I used to draw a salary from the commission. It's about $79,500, and it hasn't changed in a long time. It's been that for a long time.
Okay, there's so many good questions. I hardly know. This is going to be kind of disorganized because of the moderator, not because of you. Is there any law or rule that commissioners cannot have a financial investment business ties to the HCC?
Yes. So there are conflict of interest rules that govern the commission. And so one of the first things the commissioners are told and advised by commission attorneys when they come in is to divest of any utility stocks that they might own, to divest of any interests and any interest that might come before the commission. And it has tripped up a couple of commissioners in the past. One commissioner, I believe, had to resign back before I was appointed for that purpose.
Can commission candidates accept funds from regulated entities, and how is this enforced or made transparent? Why are they allowed to accept campaign funds at all?
Well, let me answer for TEP. So the answer is yes, they can, but our longstanding policy at Tucson Electric is not to contribute to any corporation commission candidate, their campaign or for or against that particular candidate. So that's our policy at Tucson Electric. But utilities can participate in elections and have in the past, and I'll let Chris expound upon that.
Sure, and I appreciate that, and I was asked to think about sort of some of the potential reforms that we could think about for the commission, and if there is one reform that we desperately need in this state, and that I would advocate for the moment if I were to be reelected to the commission or elected to some other office where this could be done, or if I, just as a citizen, I think we could do it through a ballot initiative, is that utilities should no longer be allowed to spend money in elections. And one of the things that has devastated and deeply undermined and corrupted the commission process in the last decade since I left, and this all started right after I left, is the fact that APS has decided to spend millions of dollars to basically handpick their own chosen regulators. And I do commend TEP for not going down that road. APS is the only utility in Arizona who has made that choice. It's an outrageous choice. It is a terrible, terrible corrupting choice. And it has undermined the public's trust in the commission. I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads. And so the commission tomorrow, I believe, has the constitutional power. I mean, when you think about the constitutional powers of this commission, to ban these utilities from ever again spending a dime on commission races, or for that matter, any other political race. APS also spent $40 million to oppose Prop 127. That proposition had no chance because APS spent our money against an issue that was overwhelmingly supported by Arizonans. So that is one of the most offensive things in my mind about utilities spending any money on elections, which is that they are spending ratepayer money to oppose us. And it's not as if we have a choice. We live in their service territory. So if I live in APS's service territory, I am literally sending money into their coffers that they are turning around and spending on issues and candidates that I am not in favor of. And I have no choice in the matter. And so that to me is not only deeply offensive, it ought to be illegal. And the commission could make it illegal tomorrow if it wanted to. And we as voters could put it on a ballot and try to pass it as an initiative. Unfortunately, as of today, APS would probably spend $40 million against that ballot initiative too. So something has got to change, because not only is APS spending that kind of money on commission races, they are spending that kind of money on every statewide race. So they spent money on the governorship, Secretary of State, I think in 2016, this occurred, 2014, it certainly occurred, on every single row office in the state of Arizona. And the problem with that is, this is not just some, run-of-the-mill corporation. This is a corporation with virtually unlimited amounts of money. The revenue requirements that these utilities are receiving are in the, what was your revenue requirement last year, Chris? Do you remember? Or for the last cycle? What's your annual revenue requirement?
It's around $800 million.
$800 million. Now, again, they're not doing it, but APS is even more than that. And that's a lot of money to be able to spend. I mean, APS spent something like, I think, 3% of its profits. That $40 million against 127 was just 3% of their profits. So think about that. It's impossible to match. So that's got to change. I am hopeful that we've got a couple of commissioners who are bravely challenging this now at the commission, but that's something we've got to get a hold of.
sort of follow-up question, and then Chris, I'll let you address what Kristin said too. TEP campaigned against Prop 127 for solar power goals. Are the costs of this campaign recovered through rates? If not, how are they recovered?
So, great question, and this kind of goes to a little bit of a follow-up I was going to provide. So we did I'm sorry. So TEP did spend a little less than $200,000 for Prop 127 in terms of education and outreach. That was all from profits, so it wasn't customer funded. That was part of that rate of return calculation I mentioned to you earlier in our rates. It was funded through that mechanism. As far as 127 goes, I hate to go back and argue the past again, but and this goes a little bit towards our diversification plan as a utility. So Chris mentioned earlier, our current standard in the state is 15% by 2025. She said we need to do more. We agree. We came out a couple years ago with the goal of 30% renewables by 2030. We're on that path today. We'll probably get there before 2030. One of the reasons that we opposed 127, we make investments in these facilities that last 30, 40, and 50 years, and it's difficult to unwind those in a quick manner, where 127 would have kind of shortened the timeline where we could do that and minimize bill impacts to customers. So we're certainly, I don't dispute any of the facts on the cost of renewables that Chris talked about. We just think that there's a more gradual path to get there to try and minimize the long-term rate impacts on our customers. So, and just real quickly, if I can comment on our participation in statewide elections, whether it's local, state, and federal elections. Our participation is solely through an employee-funded political action committee, so we don't use any corporate money for that, and we contribute equally to candidates on both sides of the ticket. So just wanted to contrast that with some of the other utilities in the state.
Could I just,
Sure.
So, and I appreciate Chris's viewpoints on this, but I think it is important to note that TEP does have a better renewable energy target, but it's just a target. It's not a requirement. And they can or cannot, depending on the whim of whoever the CEO is, and I believe very much in the current CEO, but whoever the CEO is can make a different decision. And so that's 30% is good. It's not good enough. I mean, our surrounding states are at 50%. Some are going to 100%. So I would question why 30%, especially when this is the least cost resource. TEP did not spend anywhere near what APS spent. I think it was, what, 100,000, 200,000, something like that against Prop 127. It should have been zero. But this notion, and APS used this notion repeatedly that this was not ratepayer money, the 40 million. Baloney, it's not ratepayer money. You bet it's ratepayer money. Their profits come from one source, ratepayers. All of these utilities are basically vertically integrated entities with no other core business except the utility. So they make their profits from us. So the fact that they're claiming that it's coming from profits is baloney, it's specious, and it should be rejected.
This next question, I think, is a follow-up to what you were talking about earlier, Kristin. This person wonders if utilities funding election issues should be decided by the courts.
Yeah, and I think it could be. I mean, I think that eventually you could have a challenge if APS continues to lose its mind and engage in this kind of behavior. I think you could see a challenge in which the free speech rights of ratepayers are asserted, such that I think there is a claim, and there was actually a case against unions recently in which the unions, the claim was made actually from the right that union dues were an abridgment of the free speech rights of the union members, forced union dues. So I think there could be a case that comes about in which ratepayers say, you can't use my money without my permission on speech that goes against what I want to say. It's, I have no say in that, and that money is being used against me. So I think it could end up in the courts, actually.
This next question is about water. And Kristin, one of the things I wondered if you could differentiate for people first, is Tucson water governed by the Corporation Commission? How about Phoenix water? In other words, what is the difference between a publicly operated utility like we have here in town and a private company like Vail Water Company? What's the difference?
So Vail Water Company is regulated by the commission. The private water companies around Tucson are. I think Metro Water is a private water company, if I'm not mistaken. Tucson Water, Phoenix Water, the municipal systems are not regulated by the commission. They are regulated by the city councils in which they exist. So city councils set those rates for those utilities.
Thank you. Okay, now a couple of questions about water issues. Given water issues in Arizona, does it make sense to increase the cost of water to customers? Water is more expensive in other states while serving more water per person. Could this be done? The private water companies, could you increase the cost to cut down on water use?
So, it's never popular to say that water rate should be increased, obviously, but, and that's a difficult thing to say, and, when you raise rates, you have to be very careful of protecting low-income customers. But I think we are entering a time in which no politician can stand before you or sit before you and tell you that water rates are where they should be in this state. We have to have tiered water rates that encourage conservation at the bare minimum, probably with some aggressive tiering to encourage conservation. In some parts of the state, our water rates are lower than in Michigan, in some of the Midwestern states. It doesn't make a lot of sense. The other thing that we have to do, and one of the things I've been deeply disappointed in the drought contingency planning process, is there's zero conservation measures in that thing. This notion that we would pass a DCP to solve the Lake Mead water crisis that has no water conservation measures in it is outrageous. This was not a victory for our state. This was a kicking the can down the road exercise. And then we put into it a measure that would create, basically the dewatering of Pinal County. It's hard to fathom why anybody thought that was a good response to this crisis. So the next governor is going to have to really take this problem and provide real solutions to it, and that includes all 300 water companies regulated by the commission should have aggressive conservation measures passed so that we have incentives provided for low flow shower heads and low flush toilets, which can be done in the same way we passed an energy efficiency resource standard. We can pass for our water companies and our municipal utility companies conservation measures that incentivize these measures in homes and businesses, and at the same time create new industries and companies for our state. So I mentioned we created 435 new companies that were thrown off of of the rooftop solar requirements that we've set. The same thing would happen if we did a moonshot for conservation in Arizona. And we need a governor with vision, who's really going to think, and legislators with vision. You have some down here. We're really going to think through this and include conservation at the front end of these processes.
Chris, Norman, maybe you can answer this next question. When you showed the rate structure on the PowerPoint, I think this question may be related to that. What is the reason for charging different rates to different segments of the economy?
Good question. So we do have different rate structures for different types of customers, just based on how they use energy. And not to get too technical here, but our mining customers tend to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, kind of flat out. So their load kind of just looks the same all the time. It doesn't necessarily make sense to charge them on and here's where we're going to get a little nerdy, between the difference between demand and energy. But think of demand as, at a particular point in time, how much of their system are they using at one point in time? Well, it's the same flat out across 365 days of the year. So there's what's called a demand charge on their bills, which sends them a price signal where it's not so much based on the volume of electricity they use, but the demand they place on the system. Whereas for residential customers, while we have optional rates that have that demand component in them, it makes more sense to have just your standard customer charge and then a usage charge based on the electricity you consume throughout the day. And then we've got different rates that give you price signals if you want to try and conserve the peak hours. That's a lower rate. If you want to use more off-peak, or if you use at peak hours, that's a higher rate. If you choose to conserve, you save that. If you shift your usage off-peak, that's an even lower rate. So we try to send those price signals through optional rates. But different customers have different types of energy demands, and so we've got to put price structures in place that make sense for those customers.
Here's a question that both of you, I think, can address. Why won't the ACC change the rule about how utility profit is calculated?
I'm not sure.
Specific, well, so in a way, this is actually a pretty incisive question, because the way the commissions across the country, actually, and I got to this a little bit when I showed that formula for rate making, really do need to start thinking about changing the way we set profits at utilities, because we are incentivizing the wrong thing. By setting rates on a rate base, by basically saying to Chris, your company is going to make money based on how much big stuff you build and jam into rate base, and then we we multiply a rate of return against that. All we're doing is saying to Chris, you're going to make more money by building more big stuff. But that is not what we need in an increasingly decentralized world in which we want more solar rooftops, we want more energy efficiency, we want more people, we want more electric vehicles, more storage, we want more people involved in creating their own energy. So I would like to see a world in which Chris's company is incentivized through what's called performance-based rate making, in which the better Chris does at helping you go solar, the better Chris does at getting energy efficiency measures implemented in places like this library and in our homes, the better Chris does at electrifying our transportation grid, the more money he makes. Because that's when we start to incentivize the world we envision and we want, instead of the world that they envision based on a 100-year-old rate-making formula.
We have quite a few questions, so maybe we can shorten some of our answers here. Let's talk a little more about some of the solar issues. Some of you should print. I'm having trouble reading some of this writing, so I apologize if I don't quote you exactly. How can we change ruling government in buildings to require solar energy and new commercial construction? Do you have programs, for example, at TP, where you do this kind of incentivizing?
We do, certainly for energy efficiency. So just last week, or 2 weeks ago now, our 2018, I know we're already in 2019, but it's okay. We got a new energy efficiency plan approved, and so it continues incentivizing buildings for lighting upgrades, etc. There's a nice low-income program where we increase the cap on low-income home weatherization from $3,000 to $6,000 to bring us in line with Phoenix. Your question, I think, was more about commercial development. we do work, and a lot of these conversations aren't public, but we do work with a lot of commercial customers on, we want to go 100%, as Chris was talking about earlier, hey, we want 100% of our energy to come from renewables. We can do special contracts with them that are approved by the commission. We have programs for customers, whether it's commercial or residential, to go 100% solar, whether without putting panels on their roofs if they choose not to. And so we're constantly working from an economic development perspective with current customers and prospective customers about how can we get more of our power from green resources. And we've got a big project coming online in 2020, a 100 megawatt solar facility has a battery, 30 megawatts of battery attached to it, a wind project in the following year coming online. So as I mentioned earlier, we're well on our way to this 30 by 30 target that our CEO has stated a couple years ago.
This question I think is kind of the same, but it's a good question, so I'm going to ask Chris Norman. Recent contracts for wind, solar, and storage have been less expensive than ever, than even existing coal and natural gas generators. Will TEP be investing in substantially more renewable energy to benefit from the financial, health, and climate benefits? I think you just answered that, but if you want to reaffirm that, I think that was a great question I should have asked earlier.
Sure, no, it is a great question. If you looked even just 10 years ago, roughly 80% of our energy came from coal-based resources, and that was a result of 30 years ago when President Carter passed certain regulations, and we made these investments a long time ago. But luckily, some of these coal plants are now coming at the end of their useful life, so they're getting closed for other environmental reasons. So as we step out of those resources, that's allowing us to build and invest in more renewable power. So as I mentioned earlier, we got 100 megawatts of solar coming online later this year, early next year, that has storage attached to it. Another 100 megawatt wind project that we're participating in. And then we're looking at up to 250 megawatts of additional wind that could come in online in the 2022 timeframe. So we're certainly, we see the benefits and those price decreases in the market, and continue to invest in renewables for sure.
And this one, which again goes along with this, and both of you will probably want to weigh in on this one. The ACC is establishing dockets on new net metering standards for large users. This will allow large users to generate power off-site. Does TEP support this? How will it affect your operations? It's kind of along the same line, I think.
Yeah, so, I mean, there won't be any, so Chris mentioned earlier, was talking about net metering. So our largest customers still have the full benefits of net metering. The commission there's various workshops ongoing now on electric vehicles. So in that energy efficiency plan I mentioned that we got approved last week, as far as I know, we're the first utility in the state that has a formal electric vehicle policy that's been approved by the commission. And so we'll look at ramping that out. There's still some stakeholder meetings that are occurring at the commission, so we're going to wait until those kind of complete until we go full bore into these programs. There's policies looking at revising the renewable energy standard that Chris talked about earlier. It probably is time to relook at that. 15% certainly isn't enough by 2025, and we agree with that. The commission, I think, is going to relook at their energy efficiency standard. That's sunsets here coming up in 2020, and so I would expect that would get revised in some form or fashion. And so we'll certainly be a participant in all those proceedings at the commission here in the near future.
This is a good basic question. What is the cutting edge technology with solar storage?
Well, I'll let Chris chime in here too, but I mean, storage, up until 5 or 10 years ago, that was the big problem with energy, right? Is you really couldn't store it cost effectively. Storage technologies are changing every day. They're becoming more cost effective. We already have 20 megawatts of storage installed here in Tucson. Like I mentioned before, we're bringing on another 30 megawatts. It really is a very compatible resource with solar, because you can store that solar and use it when you need it. So it's a great way to store it when it's sun shining, and then use it at on-peak times or even overnight. And so the cutting edge really is the technology itself, but then the cost, as it continues to come down, it becomes more and more viable as an investment for us.
And I would just add, and I'm not, Chris is much more of a storage expert than I am, but I think from a regulatory standpoint and from the standpoint of our state, what's gonna be so fascinating is what happens when storage becomes completely commercially viable. And we all can install storage at our houses, rooftop solar plus storage, which makes all of our houses mini power plants. And there will come a day when we can divorce ourselves from these utilities. And that, what's called grid defection, divorce, grid defection, whatever you want to call it, is sort of what has happened to many industries that are now no longer. Kodak, the record industry, trains, and the difference here, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this at ASU, the difference here is, if everybody leaves Kodak, there's not a great societal detriment. If everybody leaves TEP, or half of TEP's base leaves at the same time, there can be a detriment to those who don't leave, and they're left with more of the burden. So we have got to be able to facilitate both the right of people to leave when these technologies are commercialized, but also how do we engineer a safe and smooth transition. And then for the utilities, what I always say to executives like Chris is, how do you engineer your way into that future? How is TEP going to be a part of that future and not the next Kodak? Because if you're not careful, you are going to be the next Kodak.
This next question is a little touchy, and so I think we have to be careful not to mention specific solar energy companies. But the questioner wonders, are all of these solar companies connected to their local and electrical provider?
Well, the short answer is no. I mean, we don't have any local installers that we own or have investments in. I don't know if that was the question, but
It seemed to be.
so no, we can't. We're not in that market, and so they are completely 100% independent of TEP.
Does the ACC have any authority to require transition to renewable energy because of long-term costs of climate change, not just current and projected costs of solar, wind, and so forth?
Yes, and here's why. Not only does the commission have the authority under its constitutional rate-making responsibilities pursuant to the Constitution to order the utilities to use a certain energy mix, which we did through the Renewable Energy Standard and the Energy Efficiency Resource Standard. But it also has the constitutional authority and requirement to act in the public interest. And I always took a very broad view of what the public interest is, and I think the commission can do that and has done that. And I would just urge you, as you see candidates come through here and other organizations you're a part of, ask them what their view of the public interest test is of the Corporation Commission.
Thank you. What factors are needed to move Arizona to a sensibly much higher renewable energy source, and soon? That kind of gets, it's a repeat, but I thought maybe you both would want to weigh in on some ideas that you might have on moving the whole state towards higher goals.
Sure, that's a great question. So it's tough for utilities to turn on a dime. So and I kind of alluded to that earlier. So I think, like the Renewable Energy Standard had certain targets that were to be met over about a 15-year period. I think it was adopted around 2010. And so something similar to that, I know Commissioner Toglin had proposed, I think it was last year, an energy modernization plan that said, it had a lot of components, but 80% carbon-free, basically, resources by 2050. We like an approach like that, where it has lots of different, it included electric vehicles, it included storage, included energy efficiency, solar, wind, you name it, it had almost the whole kitchen sink in there in terms of the different tools in the toolbox. So I think flexibility with certain targets that are to be met would be the best path forward to encouraging more renewables. But like I said, the economy and price changes are going to drive that as well. The market will drive that as well. And as I mentioned to you before, you've seen us transition from a predominantly coal-based utility now to where by 2030, based on our current plans, a third of our portfolio will be renewables. So I think those two things, some good policy from the commission that gives flexibility, as well as just markets and economics are going to drive that as well.
So I would say the exact opposite. Good policy from the commission would allow for very little flexibility for these utilities, and while TEP I think may be the exception, APS just put forward an integrated resource plan, a plan that they're required to put forward every 2 years that says they will do 0 new solar energy in the state of Arizona for the next 10 years. That utility deserves 0 flexibility in my mind. That utility needs to be told that it must do a certain amount of solar, wind, biomass, geothermal, and exactly in what proportions over the next 20 years. And a funny thing happens along the way when you do tell the utilities what they have to do. They do it. They're really good at it. And then they realize, oh my God, I can actually rate base some of these resources and I can actually make money off of it. And gee, that's a good thing too. So win, win, win. And so, we did allow TEP and APS to rate base some solar energy, and they did make money off of it. And these guys are really good at what they do. They're good at energy resources. So, but sometimes some utilities have to be told, they have to be led. And that's what the Corporation Commission is there to do. They're there to lead. They're not to be led by the utilities, they're there to lead the utilities.
This question pertains specifically to TEP. In a recent ACC decision, TEP won the right to install 10 RICE generators at the Irvington campus. Given the current costs of generation, does that decision still make sense? That kind of puts you on the hot seat.
No, that's okay. So last year we got approval to construct the facility. So just really quick. So at the Irvington campus, we have 4 old gas steam units that were built in the 50s and 60s. We're going to retire 2 of those, and right now we're in the process of constructing 10, for lack of a better term, jet engines that have ramping capability from 5 megawatts up to 20 megawatts. And you say, well, why are you doing that? Well, one, we're retiring those older units. We're going to save 70% water, emissions reductions of 40%. But the other thing these units are going to help us do is, I talked about earlier that you always can't count on solar and wind 100% of the time. It creates some variability in our system. So these are flexible generating units that can ramp up and down with the variability of solar, the more solar that's coming onto our system. So one way to do that is with fast ramping generation to meet those peaks and valleys of solar. The other way is storage, which we're looking at doing more storage as well. But really, this is a great project, and again, it's in the middle of being constructed. We got the site approval to construct it, but it hasn't been formally approved by the commission in terms of an investment that we can charge to customers yet. But it's a cool project. It's kind of state of the art. It's an old technology, but it really helps us with the intermittency of the penetration of solar and wind on our system. Deal with those challenges that it creates on our distribution system.
Two last questions, and this question I'm going to ask because we talked about it earlier, and these commissioners are elected on a political party basis. Can a Republican RUCO chair really advocate for residential customers? How can 4 out of 5 Republicans on the ACC really care about clean energy? But what the question really ought to be, should these commissioners be elected on a nonpartisan basis? I think that's the question we need to ask.
So, This is a hard one for me. I think there was a day in our state when, and hopefully a day again, when an all Republican commission or a majority Republican commission can adopt pro clean energy or pro renewables stances. It was an all Republican commission that established the renewable energy standard. For 30 years, up until 3 weeks ago, I was a Republican. I switched parties three weeks ago. So I think that, I hope and pray that that day will come. I certainly think that the Republican leadership has become completely unmoored from its own people. Most Republicans support clean energy, as I mentioned. Every poll shown in this state, done in this state, shows that Republicans support clean energy almost as much as Democrats do. So I think that I hope that day will come. That being said, I do think that if there was a way for this to be, if there's any statewide office that should be nonpartisan, it's this one, right? You just heard Chris and I talk about how technical this body is, how, you really, to be a good commissioner, you've got to have this crazy blend of forensic accounting and law and engineering. No human being actually has that combination. But there's nothing Republican-y or Democratic-y about that, right? It's not, politics should be as far from these issues as humanly possible. And I think those moments in time when the commission has acted, the best work the commission has ever done, in my judgment, has been when it has acted in a nonpartisan way. I mean, I never sat on a TEP rate case and thought to myself, how will the Republican Party think about this? I just didn't. To some degree, elections more generally do play into that. You have to be thinking about elections, but so if there was a way to make it a nonpartisan office, I think that'd be great. I'm not sure we can get there because it's a constitutional office.
Okay, did you get the point that in the Arizona Constitution, designated political parties are a part of this? So it would mean a constitutional amendment of some kind. The last question, I think, is one of the most difficult. What is the justification for allowing monopolies to be beholden to stockholders?
Wow.
That's for you.
Sure, well, I'll do my best to answer that one. So we do have to invest in a lot of stuff, whether it's renewables, new meter sets for customers, transmission lines to get wind power from New Mexico to Tucson, or to send power across the border to Mexico, which is another project we're working on. That takes a lot of money. And so we have to be able to go out and raise money in the financial markets, whether it's equity, so issuing stock to investors, or whether it's issuing debt. So like you and I have to go get a mortgage for our home. We got to go out and prove our credit worthiness, so we're going to be able to repay that loan. And so the business model we work under today is that we rely on those external funds to help fund all the investments we make in our system. And so we have shareholders and bondholders that are expecting not only to get their money back, but maybe a little bit more. And so while it is sort of an aging business model, monopolies, and we think about the stuff every day that Chris was talking about new technologies coming, what's the next big thing. We're trying to get out ahead of that with some of these policies I was talking about, electric vehicles. We're thinking about storage. We're thinking about new rates for customers where they can put in the smart thermostat and the solar hot water heater and the electric vehicle charging station. How do you get those things to talk? How do you get it to talk with our system so that we can leverage those benefits and lower costs for all customers? So I'm not sure I'm answering the question very well, but we do have to rely on other, not just funding from the rates we collect from customers, but we have to go raise money in the capital markets, and those folks expect some kind of return on their investment, and we got to deliver that. There is a correlation between the financial strength and credit ratings of utilities and the rates they charge customers. So when you have a financially weak utility, it costs more to go raise that money, and that eventually gets passed through to ratepayers. So there is a balance, just reasonable in the public interest between customer rates and profits that the utility has to make. It's a tricky one, it's a controversial one, but it's kind of the business we live in, so.
Chris?
Yeah, and Chris did a great job of laying that out. I mean, most of the utilities that the commission does regulate are, investor utilities, except for the electric co-ops that we regulate, the commission regulates. It's a sort of a fact of life. Oftentimes it's, I found it to be sometimes an unhelpful fact of life as a regulator. I can remember times during the 2000s when natural gas prices had spiked really high and the utilities were coming in for constant rate increases because of those gas prices. And they were using as an argument for why the Corporation Commission had to pass these rate increases the fact that Wall Street and these bond agencies were going to downgrade their credit as a reason for why we had to do it. So it was this Damocles sword over the head of the commissioners saying, commissioners, if you don't raise rates, you're going to lower the bond rating of APS to junk bond status. And do you want to be responsible for that? And so that's really hard. That's difficult and not really fair to ratepayers. The other thing, and I think is fascinating, I just did an op-ed piece that ran in the Arizona Republic a few weeks ago about this. I don't know if you all have watched the Pacific Gas and Electric bankruptcy situation caused by the wildfires, or caused by them causing the wildfires. And what I argued in that piece was utility executives and their shareholders are going to have to take account of the risks and the threats associated with climate change. And they must do a better job of not only reporting those risks of climate change to their regulators and to their customers and to the street, but they also have to do a better job of mitigating those climate change risks. And that increasingly is going to mean doing energy, I think, in a different way. So we cannot any longer afford to be stringing so many long transmission lines across tinderbox terrain, to thermal power plants, which causes risk of wildfire. We need to be thinking about decentralized solutions like solar rooftops, like energy efficiency, like electric vehicles, like storage, like solutions that are closer to our cities and inside our cities. And so, this threat, this reality of climate change is really going to be increasingly drive, I think, the way our utilities build out their system. And let's remember, we're also building out these systems in places like my hometown of Prescott that are in these wildland urban interfaces threatened constantly by wildfire. So how do we build their systems in a responsible way that is resilient against climate change?
Thank you so much to our speakers. Let's give them a round of applause. Being such an attentive audience and sending in those awesome questions.